to another edition of Railfan Robert's Reading Railroad. Tonight, the Hardy Boys in the Tower Treasure, Part 2, Chapter 3, The Threat. "You're getting to be pretty good on that motorcycle, Frank," Joe said as the boys rode into the Hardy garage. "I'm not even scared to ride alongside you anymore." "You're not scared," Frank pretended to take Joe seriously. "What about me, riding with a daredevil like you?" "Well," Joe countered, "let's just admit that we're both pretty good." "It was sure swell of Dad to let us have them," Joe continued. "Yes," Frank agreed, "and if we're going to be detectives, we'll get a lot of use out of them." The boys started toward the house, passing the old-fashioned barn on the property. Its first floor had been converted into a gymnasium, which was used after school and on weekends by Frank, Joe, and their friends. The Hardy home on the corner of High and Elm Streets was an old stone house set in a large tree-shaded lawn. Right now, crocuses and miniature narcissi were sticking their heads through the light green grass. "Hello, Mother," said Frank as he pushed open the kitchen door. Mrs. Hardy, a pretty woman, looked up from the table on which she was stuffing a large roasted chicken and smiled. Her sons kissed her affectionately, and Joe asked, "Is Dad upstairs?" "Yes, dear, he's in his study." The study was Fenton Hardy's workshop. Adjoining it was a fine library which contained not only books, but files of disguises, records of criminal cases, and translations of thousands of codes. Walking into the study, Frank and Joe greeted their father. "We're reporting errand accomplished," Frank announced. "Fine," Mr. Hardy replied. Then he gave his sons a searching glance. "I'd say your trip netted you more than just my errand." Frank and Joe learned early in their boyhood that it was impossible to keep any secrets from their astute father. They assumed that this ability was one reason why he had been such a successful detective on the New York City police force before setting up a private practice in Bayport. "We ran into some real excitement," Frank said, and told his father the whole story of Chet's missing jalopy, the wrecked car, which they suspected had been a stolen one also, and the attempted holdup at the ferry boat office. "Chet's counting on us to find his car," Joe added. Frank grinned. "That is, unless the police find it first." Mr. Hardy was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Do you want a little advice? You know I never give it unless I'm asked for it," he chuckled. "We'll need a lot of help," Joe answered. Mr. Hardy said that to him the most interesting angle to the case was the fact that the suspect apparently used one or more wigs as a disguise. He may have bought at least one of them in Bayport. I suggest you boys make the rounds of all the shops selling wigs and see what you can find out. The boys glanced at the clock on their father's large desk. Then Frank said, "We'll have time to do a little sleuthing before closing time. Let's go." The two boys made a dash for the door, then both stopped short. They did not have the slightest idea where they were going. Sheepishly, Joe asked, "Dad, do you know which stores sell wigs?" With a twinkle in his eye, Mr. Hardy arose from the desk, walked to the library, and opened a file drawer labeled W through Z. A moment later, he pulled out a thick folder marked Wigs, Manufacturers, Distributors, and Retail Shops of the World. "Why, Dad, I didn't know you had all this information," Joe began. His father merely smiled. He thumbed through the heavy sheaf of papers and pulled one out. Bayport, he read. Well, 3 of these places can be eliminated at once. They sell only women's hair pieces. Now let's see. Frank, get a paper and pencil. First, there's Schwartz Masquerade and Costume Shop. It's at 79 Renshaw Avenue. Then there's Flint's at Market and Pine. And one more, Reuben Brothers. That's on Main Street, just this side of the railroad. Schwartz is closest, Frank spoke up. Let's try him first, Joe. Hopefully, the boys dashed out to their motorcycles and hurried downtown. As they entered Schwartz's shop, a short, plump, smiling man came toward them. Well, you just got under the wire, fellows, he said, looking up at a large old-fashioned clock on the wall. I was going to close up promptly tonight because a big shipment came in today, and I never have time except after business hours to unpack and list my merchandise. Our errand won't take long, said Frank. We're sons of Fenton Hardy, the detective. We'd like to know whether or not you recently sold a red wig to a man. Mr. Schwartz shook his head. I haven't sold a red wig in months, or even rented one out. Everybody seems to want blonde or brown or black lately. But you understand, I don't usually sell wigs at all. I rent them out. I understand, said Frank. We're just trying to figure out about a man who uses a red wig as a disguise. We thought he may have bought one or rented it here, and that you would know his name. Mr. Schwartz leaned across the counter. This man you speak of, he sounds like a character. It's just possible he may come in to get a wig from me. If he does, I'll be glad to let you know. The boys thanked the shopkeeper and were about to leave when Mr. Schwartz called, Hold on a minute. The Hardys hoped that the dealer suddenly remembered something important. This was not the case, however. With a grin, the man asked the boys if they would like to help him open some cartons, which had arrived, and to try on the costumes. The folks at the factory don't always get the sizes marked right, he said. Would you be able to stay a few minutes and help me? I'll be glad to pay you. Oh, we don't want any money, Joe spoke up. To tell you the truth, I'd like to see your costumes. Mr. Schwartz locked the front door of his shop, then led the boys into a rear room. It was so filled with costumes of all kinds and paraphernalia for theatrical work, plus piles of cartons, that Frank and Joe wondered how the man could ever find anything. Here is today's shipment, Mr. Schwartz said, pointing to 6 cartons standing not far from the rear entrance to his shop. Together he and the boys slid open the boxes and one by one lifted out a king's robe, a queen's tiara, and a little Bo Peep costume. Suddenly Mr. Schwartz said, Here's a skeleton marked size 38. Would one of you boys mind trying it on? Frank picked up the costume, unzipped the back, and stepped into the skeleton outfit. It was tremendous on him, and the ribs sagged luxuriously. Guess a fat man modeled for this, he remarked, holding the garment out to his full width. At that moment, there was a loud rap on the front door of the store. Mr. Schwartz made no move to answer it. I'm closed, he said. Let him rap. Suddenly, Frank had an idea. The thief who used wigs might be the late customer coming on purpose at this hour to avoid meeting other people. Without a word to the others, he dashed through the doorway into the store and toward the front entrance. He could vaguely see someone waiting to be admitted, but the stranger gave one look at the leaping out-of-shape skeleton and disappeared in a flash. At the same moment, Frank tripped and fell headlong. Mr. Schwartz and Joe, hearing the crash, rushed out to see what had happened. Frank, hopelessly tangled in the skeleton attire, was helped to his feet. When he told the others why he had made his unsuccessful dash to the front door, they conceded he might have a point. "Well, you sure scared him away in that outfit," Joe said, laughing. "He won't be back." The boys stayed for over half an hour helping Mr. Schwartz, then said goodbye and went home. "Monday we'll tackle those other two wig shops, Frank," said Frank. The following morning, the Hardy family attended church. Then, after dinner, Frank and Joe told their parents they were going to ride out to see Chet Wharton. "We've been invited to stay to supper," Frank added, "but we promised not to get home late." The boys picked up Callie Shaw, who also had been invited. Callie, she perched on the seat behind Frank. "Hold on, Callie," Joe teased. "Frank's a wild cyclist." The young people were greeted at the door of the Morton farmhouse by Chet's younger sister, Iowa, dark-haired and pretty. Joe Hardy thought she was quite the nicest girl in Bayport High and dated her regularly. As dusk came on, the 5 young people gathered in the Morton's kitchen to prepare supper. Chet, who loved to eat, was in charge and doled out the various jobs to the others. When he finished, Joe remarked, "And what are you going to do, big boy?" The stout youth grinned. "I'm the official taster." A howl went up from the others. "No worky, no eating," said Iowa flatly. Chet grinned. "Oh, well, if you insist, I'll make a little side dish for all of us." "How about Welsh rabbit?" "You're elected," the others chorused, and Chet set to work. The farmhouse kitchen was large and contained a group of windows in one corner. Here stood a large table where the young people decided to eat. They had just sat down when the telephone rang. Chet got up and walked out to the hall to answer. Within a minute, he re-entered the kitchen, his eyes bulging. "What's the matter?" Lola asked quickly. I've been threatened," Chet replied. "Threatened?" the others cried out. "How?" Chet was so frightened he could hardly speak, but he managed to make the others understand that a man had just said on the telephone, "You'll never get your jalopy back, and if you don't lay off trying to find me or your car, you're going to get hurt." "Phew!" cried Joe. "This is getting serious." Callie and Lola had clutched their throats and were staring wide-eyed at Chet. Frank, about to speak, happened to glance out the window toward the barn. For an instant, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but no, they were not. A figure was sneaking from the barn and down the lane toward the highway. "Fellows," he cried suddenly, "follow me." Chapter 4. Red versus Yellow. By the time the Hardy boys and Chet had raced from the Morton's kitchen, the prowler was not in sight. Thinking he had run across one of the fields, the 3 pursuers scattered in various directions to search. Joe struck out straight ahead and pressed his ear to the ground to listen for receding footsteps. He could hear none. Presently, the 3 boys met up once more to discuss their failure to catch the man and to question why he had been there. "Do you think he was a thief?" Joe asked Chet. "What would he steal?" "Search me," the stout boy replied. "Let's take a look." "I believe he was carrying something, but I couldn't see what it was," Frank revealed. The barn door had not been closed yet for the night, and the boys walked in. Chet turned on the lights, and the searchers gazed around. "Look!" Frank cried suddenly. He pointed to the floor below the telephone extension in the barn. There lay a man's gray wig. "The intruders!" Joe exclaimed. It sure looks so," Frank agreed, "and something must have scared him." In his hurry to get away, he must have dropped this. Frank picked up the wig and examined it carefully for a clue. No identifying mark in it. Say, I have an idea, he burst out. That man phoned you from here, Chet. You mean he's the one who threatened me? Yes, if you know how. You can call your own telephone number from an extension. That's right. Chet was wagging his head. You mean that guy bothered to come all the way out here to use this phone to threaten me? Why? Both Hardys said they felt the man had not come specifically for that reason. There was another more important one. We must figure it out, Chet. You ought to be able to answer that better than anybody else. What is there, or what was there in this barn to interest such a person? The stout boy scratched his head and let his eyes wander around the building. It wouldn't be any of the livestock, he said slowly, and it couldn't be hay or feed. Suddenly, Chet snapped his fingers. Maybe I have the answer. Wait a minute, fellows. He disappeared from the barn and made a beeline for the garage. Chet hurried inside, but was back in a few seconds. I have it, he shouted. The guy came here to get the spare tire for the jalopy. The one you had is gone? Frank asked. Chet nodded. He suggested that perhaps the man was not too far away. He might be on some side road changing the tire. Let's find out, he urged. Although the Hardys felt that it would be a useless search, they agreed to go along. They got on their motorcycles with Chet riding behind Joe. The boys went up one road and down another, covering the territory very thoroughly. They saw no parked car. Not even any evidence that a driver pulled off the road and stayed to change a tire, Frank remarked. No footprints, no tool marks, no treads. That guy must have had somebody around to pick him up, Chet concluded with a sigh. Cheer up, Chet, Frank said as they walked back to the house. That spare tire may turn out to be a clue in this case. When the boys entered the kitchen again, they were met with anxious inquiries from Callie and Lola. What in the world were you doing, dashing out of here without a word? Callie asked in a shaking voice. Yeah, what's going on? You had us frightened silly, Lola joined in. First, Chet gets a threatening phone call, and then suddenly all three of you run out of the house like madmen. Calm down, girls, Frank said soothingly. I saw a prowler, and we were looking for him, but all we found was this. He tossed the gray wig onto a chair in the hall. Suddenly there was a loud wail from Chet. My Welsh rabbit! It's been standing so long it'll be ruined. Lola began to giggle. Oh, you men, she said. Do you suppose Callie and I would let all that good cheese go to waste? We kept the Welsh rabbit. It at just the right temperature and it isn't spoiled at all. Chet looked relieved as he and the others took their places at the table. Although there was a great deal of bantering during the meal, the conversation in the main revolved around Chet's missing jalopy and the thief who evidently wore hair disguises to suit his fancy. Frank and Joe asked Chet if they might take along the gray wig and examine it more thoroughly. There might be some kind of mark on it to indicate either the maker or the owner. Chet readily agreed. But when supper was over, Callie said to Frank with a teasing gleam in her eye, Why don't you hot shots loose examine that wig now? I'd like to watch your super duper methods. Just for that I will, said Frank. He went to get the wig from the hall chair and then laid it out on the kitchen table. From his pocket he took a small magnifying glass and carefully examined every inch of the lining of the wig. Nothing here, he said presently. The hair was thoroughly examined, and parted strand by strand to see if there were any identifying designations on the hairpiece. Frank could discover nothing. I'm afraid this isn't going to help us much, he said in disgust, but I'll show it to the different wingmen in town. As he finished speaking, the telephone rang and Lola went to answer it. Chet turned white and looked nervous. Was the caller the man who had threatened him? And what did he want? Presently, Lola returned to the kitchen, a worried frown on her face. It's a man for you, Chet, and he won't give his name. Trembling visibly, Chet walked slowly to the telephone. The others followed and listened. Yes, I'm Chet Morton. No, I haven't got my car back. There was a long silence as the person on the other end of the line spoke rapidly. But I haven't any money, Chet said finally. Well, okay, I'll let you know. Chet hung up and wobbled to a nearby chair. The others bombarded him with questions. The stout boy took a deep breath, then said, I can get my jalopy back, but the man wants a lot of money for the information as to where it is. Oh, I'm glad you're going to get your car back, Callie exclaimed. But I haven't gotten any money, Chet groaned. Who's the man? Frank demanded. There was another long pause before Chet answered. Then, looking at the waiting group before him, he announced simply, Smuff. Oscar Smuff. His listeners gasped in astonishment. This was the last thing they expected to hear. The detective was selling information as to where Chet would find his missing jalopy. Why, that cheap so-and-so, Joe cried out angrily. Chet explained that Smuff had said he was not in business for his help. He had to make a living, and any information which he dug up as a detective should be properly paid for. Frank shrugged. I suppose Smuff has a point there. How much does he want for the information, Chet? His fee is $25. What? The others cried out. After a long consultation, it was decided that the young people would pool their resources. Whatever sum they would collect toward the $25 would be offered to Oscar Smuff to lead them to Chet's car. But make it very plain, Frank admonished, that if it's not your jalopy Smuff leads us to, you won't pay him one nickel. Chet put in a call to Smuff's house. As expected, the detective grumbled at the offer of $10, but finally accepted it. He said he would pick up the boys in half an hour and take them to the spot. Now, about this time, Mr. and Mrs. Morton were returning home. Chet and Lola's father was a good-looking, jolly man with his son's same general build, health, and coloring. He was in the real estate business in Bayport and ran the farm as a hobby. Mrs. Morton was an older edition of her daughter, Lola, and just as witty and light-hearted. But when she learned what had transpired and that her son had been threatened, she was worried. You boys must be very careful, Mrs. Morton advised. From what I hear about Smuff, this red-haired thief could easily pull one over on him, so watch your step. Chet promised that they would. Good luck, Callie called out as Smuff beeped his horn outside the door. And don't be too late. I want to hear the news before I have to go home. Frank, Joe, and Chet had found Smuff entirely uncommunicative about where they were going. He seemed to enjoy the role he was playing. I knew I'd be the one to break this case, he boasted. Joe could not resist the temptation of asking Smuff if he was going to lead them to the thief as well as to the car. The detective flushed in embarrassment and admitted that he did not have full details yet on this part of the mystery. But it won't be long before I capture that fellow, he assured the boys. They managed to keep their faces straight and only hoped that they were not now on a wild goose chase. 20 minutes later, Smuff pulled into the town of Ducksworth and drove straight to a used car lot. Stopping, he announced, "Well, here we are. Get ready to fork over that money, Chet." Smuff nodded to the attendant in charge, then led the boys down a long aisle past row after row of cars to where several jalopies were lined up against a rear fence. Turning left, the detective finally paused before a bright red car. "Here you are," said Smuff gravely, extending his hand toward Chet. "My money, please." The stout boy, as well as the Hardys, stared at the jalopy. There was no question but that it was the same make and model as Chet's. "The thief thought he could disguise it by painting it red," Smuff explained. "Is that your guess?" Frank asked quietly. Oscar Smuff frowned. "How else could you figure it?" he asked. "Then there'll be yellow paint under the red," Frank went on. "Let's take a look to make sure." It was evident that Smuff did not like this procedure. "So you doubt me, eh?" he said in an unpleasant tone. "Anybody can get fooled," Frank told him. "Well, Chet, let's operate on this car." The detective stood by slowly as Frank pulled out a penknife and began to scrape the red paint off part of the fender. And that concludes our story for tonight. No part of this episode may be reproduced without my personal permission. Railfan Roberts Reading Railroad is a production of Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions. And all podcast episodes are owned by Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions.